So earlier today, Brian Gutekunst had an end-of-season press conference. It's about 35 minutes. I would recommend watching the whole thing if you want to hear every little thing he said. I'm going to do a recap of it and talk about some of the biggest takeaways I had. I listened to it in the past couple hours. And so I'll touch on some things he had to say about potentially adding receivers, also Jaire Alexander, that situation, and then a few comments about Jordan Love and a few other Packers players and potentially what the Packers could do this offseason. So first off here from Jason B. Hirschhorn on X. He says, Packers GM Brian Gutekunst on if team needs to add a number one receiver. Quote, I think historically, if you look at a lot of the teams, very rarely do teams that have one receiver that's super heavy with targets. That usually doesn't play out well for playoffs. And then added here from Ryan Wood, Brian Gutekunst says he's open to adding a receiver through draft or free agency, but doesn't buy into idea Jordan Love needs a wideout who dominates targets. He's expecting this current group of receivers to take a necessary step on a down-to-down basis as well. And so I think this is something that we hear from Gutekunst most years after the season is, the Packers are open to adding someone if someone comes available and they feel like a good fit. And so I think that hasn't changed this year. But I also think we see here that Gutekunst isn't in this spot, I think, where he thinks the Packers need a receiver to become a complete team, need to add someone else, even though they could potentially, and he's not against it. And I think that when you look at the Packers receivers, a lot of them dealt with drops this year. A lot of them are really good at getting open. Romeo Doubs, one of the best route runners in the NFL. Christian Watson, that does complicate things with his injury. But Gutekunst, I think, likes the fact that the Packers do spread the ball around a lot. And I think that because you have a lot of guys who are pretty talented, you're able to have a top 10 offense as the Packers had in 2024, and one guy doesn't get the massive share of targets. And I think that, you hear Gutekunst say there, he notes that a lot of teams who, end up, doing really well in the playoffs don't necessarily usually have just one guy per se. And so I think that, hearing him say that, it really makes me wonder, would he really go out and sign someone like Devontae? I would have to guess no. And let me add this final quote here, and I'll touch on Devontae for a second. But here from Gutekunst, I don't particularly want to see someone on the backside of their career. I don't think that's something I'd be particularly interested in. How old was Reggie White when Ron signed him? I mean, he was in his 30s, I believe, but he wasn't on the backside of his career by any means. So, I think it just depends on the player and what you think he has in front of him. So he was not talking about Davante Adams there, but I'm bringing up Davante now with this quote from Brian Gutekunst. And Davante right now, he's 32 years old. I would have to guess he's on the backside of his career. I guess the question is, how long do you think Davante Adams will play football? Could he play another, 8 years? I was looking up Jerry Rice played till he was about 40 or 42 years old. His later years were not as productive. So I guess, technically Davante could play a lot longer. But I think when you look around the league, guys in their mid-30s don't typically play as well. They sort of start to slowly decline as they age. And so my guess would be that Davante Adams is on the backside of his career. And so with Gutekunst saying that, I feel like if he did bring in some kind of veteran receiver, he would prefer to bring in someone who's younger, where maybe you get like a 27, 28, 29-year-old. That's better than getting a 32-year-old. I still think Davante is a good player. Just based off of that, based on Gutekunst's comments about the receiver room and how he seems pretty happy with what they're doing and just expected them to take some more strides forward, I would be pretty shocked if he brought back Davante Adams. So I don't think that's going to happen. And then here's from Matt Schneidman. Gutekunst on cap flexibility. Quote, if we kind of have to do some different things because we have an opportunity to acquire a player that can impact our team like these two guys, McKinney and Jacobs did, we'll do it. So this year with the cap situation, it is better than in years past. Currently, per over the cap, the Packers have about $50 million in cap space. And so they're going to have some money. If they want to sign some players, they will be able to. And it sounds to me like Gutekunst, if they find someone that they think is a fit for this team that can come in and play well, then I think they will take some more chances. And then here on Jaire Alexander, from Rob Domofsky, Packers GM Brian Gutekunst insisted there is no disconnect between Jaire Alexander and the team. Quote, there's frustration from both sides that he can't go out there, end of quote. Gutekunst said his contract isn't prohibitive on a return, but, quote, we'll work through that, end of quote. And let me read this one before I get into that, because I think it adds some information as well. And then from Andy Herman, Goody's thought Keyshawn on the outside played, quote, really, really well, end of quote. Also mentioned the stability of Valentine, Bullard, and Nixon playing together. And so I did hear that part of the interview where he talked about he thought that Nixon was playing at a high level on the outside. My guess would be if he thinks that the Packers may continue to have him out there on the outside. And he also brought up, as Andy Herman said, Valentine, Bullard, and Nixon playing well together. And so it does make you wonder. We've already talked a little bit about it, but with Jaire, with him dealing with so many injuries, would the Packers be willing to move on from him? He'd have a massive dead cap hit in 2025, close to $17 million. If they cut him after June 1st, release or trade him after June 1st, it's much smaller, closer to the $7 million range, somewhere around there. And so, Gutekunst notes that they could bring him back, but they'll work through that. So I think it's hard to know exactly what Gutekunst is thinking there. But the fact that he does seem pretty confident in those other corners, it does make you wonder. Maybe he would be willing to move off of Jaire, even though he, is going to be a pretty large dead cap hit. So that's something to watch. I don't think one way or the other. I'm for sure know what Gutekunst is wanting to do, but that's something to note. Then for Matt Schneidman, Brian Gutekunst on Jordan Love, quote, I think we're very, very excited about his growth. And then here from Ryan Wood, asked Brian Gutekunst where Jordan Love needs to improve most. He says an ability to control the game consistently week to week. And so Gutekunst was given some love to Jordan Love, but also mentioned how he needs to control the game and play better. And I think that, with Gutekunst and how he sees the roster, it sounds to me like he does expect these guys to really grow going into some of their third seasons starting together. And I think, the more time you play together, the more time you play football, the better you are going to play. And I made a video yesterday about why I am a little bit concerned about Jordan Love. And it's just mainly with his inconsistency, with his accuracy issues at times. I still think he's a really good quarterback, but to reach that, elite level, he's going to need to be a lot more consistent and play better overall going into 2024. Then for Matt Schneidman, Gutekunst says he wants Quay Walker here for the long term, and Devontae Wyatt was the most consistent interior pass rusher. Says both had their best years yet. Decisions on both of their fifth-year options coming up. So it sounds like Quay Walker is going to be here for a long time based on those Gutekunst comments, and I do think he's gotten better as the years have gone on. And so looking ahead, it will be interesting to watch to see if someone or who does potentially get that fifth-year option. Then from Ryan Wood, Brian Gutekunst says center Josh Myers had his best year with Packers, especially battling through injuries. Quote, I know Jordan trusts him very much as his center, end of quote. So there, could have been a potential that the Packers move on from Josh Myers after this year. But based on the fact that he's, built that chemistry with Love as his center for the past 2 seasons, and with Gutekunst thinking he had his best year, it sounds like Josh Myers is likely going to be the center going forward. And I think that, especially when it comes to the, connection, the relationship with Jordan Love as a center, that's a pretty big thing. Then from Ryan Wood, Brian Gutekunst says need for Packers to ramp up our sense of urgency has been on his mind at the end of this season, knowing these playoff opportunities are rare. We need to start competing for championships. And so I think when you see that quote, it does sound like Gutekunst is really ready to go for it. And I feel like we could see some big moves go down in free agency, depending on who's available. And I wouldn't be shocked to see a big kind of trade. It felt like in times past, he had been more hesitant to say the Packers would, go out and make some kind of big splash trade. But he didn't really rule it out today. And so I think he's really open to a lot of different things if the price was right, which I think he always is. But especially with comments like that where the urgency needs to be, higher, greater sense of urgency. I think that applies to the players, but also to what they do with this extra cap space. They have a chance to come in here, add some other really key components to this roster. So I think it's going to be a fun offseason to sort of see what Gutekunst in this front office does. And then for Matt Schneidman, Brian Gutekunst on the pass rush, quote, we didn't grow into that consistent front like we had hoped. So that's, I think, probably the Packers' biggest need is edge rusher. I would probably say that right now. I think they just need some more guys who consistently win. They need to be able to consistently get pressure with 4 players. And considering they were, a top 6 unit in the NFL, points scored wise, if you can get another really solid pass rusher in here, whether early in the draft or through a trade, I think this defense could really reach the peak in the NFL. And then finally here from Tom Silverstein, We have Gutekunst said the number one thing in his mind is that the Packers need to ramp up their sense of urgency towards winning a championship. Quote, what's out there for us as a team that we're willing to commit to and sacrifice for, he said. So that goes along the lines of a recent tweet I just read there. But, when you hear Gutekunst as a GM talking like this, I think that, now with Jordan Love, he's ended his second year starting. He's going to go into his third year starting. A lot of these Packers young players have played a lot of football now. And it felt to me like he was more patient in Jordan Love's first year and this season as well. But now it really does feel like the time where the Packers really need to get things going. And I think we saw with Aaron Rodgers, him really start to reach his peak level of play. He played really great second year, but then, when it comes to playoff time, Rodgers really started to turn it up. So I think he expects the Packers to do that, and hopefully we'll see that going into the 2025 season. That's all I have for today. If you want more Packers content, feel free to subscribe down below, and I'll see you guys next time.